He laughed in a forced, high-pitched tone and patted me on the back. Did the Nahual by any chance tell you that the Toltecs were ancient people that lived in this part of Mexico? I asked. See, there you go. That's why he didn't tell you. The old crow probably didn't know that they were ancient people. He rocked in his chair as he laughed. His laughter was very pleasing and very contagious. We are the Toltecs, maestro, he said. Rest assured that we are. That's all I know. But you can ask the witness. He knows. I lost my interest a long time ago. He stood up and went over to the stove. I followed him. He examined a pot of food cooking on a low fire. He asked me if I knew who had made that food. I was pretty sure that La Gorda had made it, but I said that I did not know. He sniffed it 4 or 5 times in short inhalations, like a dog. Then he announced that his nose told him that La Gorda had cooked it. He asked me if I had had some, and when I said that I had finished eating just before he arrived, he took a bowl from a shelf and helped himself to an enormous portion. He recommended in very strong terms that I should eat food cooked only by La Gorda, and that I should only use her bowl, as he himself was doing. I told him that La Gorda and the little sisters had served me my food in a dark bowl that they kept on a shelf apart from the others. He said that that bowl belonged to the Nahual. We went back to the table. He ate very slowly and did not talk at all. His total absorption in eating made me realize that all of them did the same thing. They ate in complete silence. La Gorda is a great cook, he said as he finished his food. She used to feed me. That was ages ago, before she hated me, before she became a witch. I mean a Toltec. He looked at me with a glint in his eye and winked. I felt obligated to comment that La Gorda did not strike me as being capable of hating anyone. I asked him if he knew that she had lost her form. That's a lot of baloney, he exclaimed. He stared at me as if measuring my look of surprise, and then hid his face under his arm and giggled like an embarrassed child. Well, she actually did do that, he added. She's just great. Why do you dislike her then? I'm going to tell you something, maestro, because I trust you. I don't dislike her at all. She's the very best. She's the Nahual's woman. I just act that way with her because I like her to pamper me, and she does. She never gets mad at me. I could do anything. Sometimes I get carried away, and I get physical with her and want to strike her. When that happens, she just jumps out of the way, like the Nahual used to do. The next minute she doesn't even remember what I did. That's a true formless warrior for you. She does the same thing with everyone. But the rest of us are a sorry mess. We are truly bad. Those 3 witches hate us, and we hate them back. You are sorcerers, Pablito. Can't you stop all this bickering? Sure we can, but we don't want to. What do you expect us to do? Be like brothers and sisters? I did not know what to say. They were the Nahual's women, he went on. and yet everybody expected me to take them. How in heaven's name am I going to do that? I tried with one of them, and instead of helping me, the bastardly witch nearly killed me. So now every one of those women is after my hide, as if I had committed a crime. All I did was to follow the Nawal's instructions. He told me that I had to be intimate with each of them, one by one, until I could hold all of them at once. But I couldn't be intimate with even one. I wanted to ask him about his mother, Doña Soledad, but I could not figure out a way to bring her into the conversation at that point. We were quiet for a moment. Do you hate them for what they tried to do to you? He asked all of a sudden. I saw my chance. No, not at all, I said. La Gorda explained to me their reasons, but Doña Soledad's attack was very scary. Do you see much of her? He did not answer. He looked at the ceiling. I repeated my question. I noticed then that his eyes were filled with tears. His body shook, convulsed by quiet sobs. He said that once he had had a beautiful mother, whom no doubt I could still remember. Her name was Manuelita, a saintly woman who raised 2 children, working like a mule to support them. He felt the most profound veneration for that mother who had loved and reared him. But one horrible day, his fate was fulfilled, and he had the misfortune to meet Gennaro and the Nawal. And between the two of them, they destroyed his life. In a very emotional tone, Pablito said that the 2 devils took his soul and his mother's soul. They killed his Manuelita and left behind that horrendous witch, Soledad. He peered at me with eyes flooded with tears and said that that hideous woman was not his mother. She could not possibly be his Manuelita. He sobbed uncontrollably. I did not know what to say. His emotional outburst was so genuine and his contention so truthful that I felt swayed by a tide of sentiment. Thinking as an average civilized man, I had to agree with him. It certainly looked as if it was a great misfortune for Pablito to have crossed the path of Don Juan and Don Gennaro. I put my arm around his shoulders and almost wept myself. After a long silence, he stood up and went to the back. I heard him blowing his nose and washing his face in a pail of water. When he returned, he was calmer. He was even smiling. Don't get me wrong, Maestro, he said. I don't blame anyone for what has happened to me. It was my fate. Gennaro and the Nawal acted like the impeccable warriors they were. I'm just weak, that's all. And I have failed in my task. The Nawal said that my only chance to avoid the attack of that horrendous witch was to corral the 4 winds, and make them into my 4 corners. But I failed. Those women were in cahoots with that witch, Soledad, and didn't want to help me. They wanted me dead. The Nawal also told me that if I failed, you wouldn't stand a chance yourself. He said that if she killed you, I had to flee and run for my life. He doubted that I could even get as far as the road. He said that with your power and with what the witch already knows, she would have been peerless. So, when I felt I had failed to corral the four winds, I considered myself dead. And of course I hated those women. But today, Maestro, you bring me new hope. I told him that his feelings for his mother had touched me very deeply. I was in fact appalled by all that had happened, but I doubted intensely that I had brought hope of any kind to him. "You have," he exclaimed with great certainty. "I've felt terrible all this time. To have your own mother coming after you with an axe is nothing anyone can feel happy about. But now she's out of the way, thanks to you and whatever you did. Those women hate me because they're convinced I'm a coward. They just can't get it through their thick heads that we are different. You and those four women are different than me and the witness and Benigno in one important way. All five of you were pretty much dead before the Nahual found you. He told us that once you had even tried to kill yourself. We were not that way. We were well and alive and happy. We are the opposite of you. You are desperate people. We are not. If Gennaro hadn't come my way, I would be a happy carpenter today. Or perhaps I would have died. It doesn't matter. I would have done what I could, and that would have been fine." His words plunged me into a curious mood. I had to admit that he was right, and that those women and myself were indeed desperate people. If I had not met Don Juan, I would no doubt be dead. But I could not say, as Pablito had, that it would have been fine with me either way. Don Juan had brought life and vigor to my body and freedom to my spirit. Pablito's statements made me remember something Don Juan had told me once when we were talking about an old man, a friend of mine. Don Juan had said in very emphatic terms that the old man's life or death had no significance whatsoever. I felt a bit cross at what I thought to be redundance on Don Juan's part. I told him that it went without saying that the life and death of that old man had no significance, since nothing in the world could possibly have any significance except to each one of us personally. "You said it," he exclaimed and laughed. "That's exactly what I mean. That old man's life and death have no significance to him personally. He could have died in 1929 or in 1950, or he could live until 1995. It doesn't matter. Everything is stupidly the same to him. My life before I met Don Juan had been that way. Nothing had ever mattered to me. I used to act as if certain things affected me, but that was only a calculated ploy to appear as a sensitive man." Pablito spoke to me and disrupted my reflections. He wanted to know if he had hurt my feelings. I assured him that it was nothing. In order to start up the conversation again, I asked him where he had met Don Gennaro. "My fate was that my boss got ill," he said, "and I had to go to the city market in his place to build a new section of clothing booths. I worked there for 2 months. While I was there, I met the daughter of the owner of one of the booths. We fell in love. I built her father's stand a little bigger than the others so I could make love to her under the counter while her sister took care of the customers. One day, Gennaro brought a sack of medicinal plants to a retailer across the aisle. And while they were talking, he noticed that the clothing stand was shaking. He looked carefully at the stand, but he only saw the sister sitting on a chair, half asleep. The man told Gennaro that every day the stand shook like that around that hour. The next day, Gennaro brought the Nahual to watch the stand shaking. And sure enough, that day, it shook. They came back the next day, and it shook again. So they waited there until I came out. That day, I made their acquaintance, and soon after Gennaro told me that he was an herbalist and proposed to make me a potion that no woman could resist. I liked women, so I fell for it. He certainly made the potion for me, but it took him 10 years. In the meantime, I got to know him very well, and I grew to love him more than if he were my own brother. And now I miss him like hell. So you see, he tricked me. Sometimes I'm glad that he did. Most of the time, I resent it though. Don Juan told me that sorcerers have to have an omen before they choose someone. Was there something of that sort with you, Pablito? Yes. Gennaro said that he got curious watching the stand shaking, and then he saw that 2 people were making love under the counter. So he sat down to wait for the people to come out. He wanted to see who they were. After a while, the girl appeared in the stand, but he missed me. He thought it was very strange that he would miss me after being so determined to set eyes on me. The next day, he came back with the Nahual. He also saw that 2 people were making love. But when it was time to catch me, they both missed me. They came back again the next day. Gennaro went around to the back of the stand, while the Nahual stayed out in front. I bumped into Gennaro while I was crawling out. I thought he hadn't seen me because I was still behind the piece of cloth that covered a small square opening I had made on the side wall. I began to bark to make him think there was a small dog under the drape. He growled and barked back at me and really made me believe that there was a huge mad dog on the other side. I got so scared I ran out the other way and crashed into the Nahual. If he would have been an ordinary man, I would have thrown him to the ground because I ran right into him. But instead, he lifted me up like a child. I was absolutely flabbergasted. For being such an old man, he was truly strong. I thought I could use a strong man like that to carry lumber for me. Besides, I didn't want to lose face with the people who had seen me running out from under the counter. I asked him if he would like to work for me. He said yes. That same day, he went to the shop and started to work as my assistant. He worked there every day for 2 months. I didn't have a chance with those two devils. The incongruous image of Don Juan working for Pablito was extremely humorous to me. Pablito began to imitate the way Don Juan carried lumber on his shoulders. I had to agree with La Gorda that Pablito was as good an actor as Josefina. Why did they go to all that trouble, Pablito? They had to trick me. You don't think that I would go with them just like that, do you? I've heard all my life about sorcerers and curers and witches and spirits, and I never believed a word of it. Those who talked about things like that were just ignorant people. If Gennaro had told me that he and his friend were sorcerers, I would have walked out on them. But they were too clever for me. Those two foxes were really sly. They were in no hurry. Gennaro said that he would have waited for me if it took him 20 years. That's why the Nahual went to work for me. I asked him to, so it was really me who gave them the key. The Nahual was a diligent worker. I was a little bit of a rascal in those days, and I thought I was the one playing a trick on him. I believed that the Nahual was just a stupid old Indian, so I told him that I was going to tell the boss that he was my grandpa. Otherwise, they wouldn't hire him. But I had to get a percentage of his salary. The Nahual said that it was fine with him. He gave me something out of the few pesos he made each day. My boss was very impressed with my grandpa because he was such a hard worker. But the other guys made fun of him. As you know, he had the habit of cracking all his joints from time to time. In the shop, he cracked them every time he carried anything. People naturally thought that he was so old that when he carried something on his back, his whole body creaked. I was pretty miserable with the Nahual as my grandpa. But by then, Gennaro had already prevailed on my greedy side. He had told me that he was feeding the Nahual a special formula made out of plants, and that it made him strong as a bull. Every day he used to bring a small bundle of mashed up green leaves and feed it to him. Gennaro said that his friend was nothing without his concoction, and to prove it to me, he didn't give it to him for 2 days. Without the green stuff, the Nahual seemed to be just a plain, ordinary old man. Gennaro told me that I could also use his concoction to make women love me. I got very interested in it, and he said that we could be partners if I would help him prepare his formula and give it to his friend. One day, he showed me some American money and told me he had sold his first batch to an American. That hooked me, and I became his partner. My partner Gennaro and I had great designs. He said that I should have my own shop, because with the money that we were going to make with his formula, I could afford anything. I bought a shop, and my partner paid for it, so I went wild. I knew that my partner was for real, and I began to work making his green stuff. I had the strange conviction at that point that Don Gennaro must have used psychotropic plants in making his concoction. I reasoned that he must have tricked Pablito into ingesting it in order to assure his compliance. "Did he give you power plants, Pablito?" I asked. "Sure," he replied. "He gave me his green stuff. I ate tons of it." He described and imitated how Don Juan would sit by the front door of Don Gennaro's house in a state of profound lethargy, and then spring to life as soon as his lips touched the concoction. Pablito said that in view of such a transformation, he was forced to try it himself. "What was in that formula?" I asked. "Green leaves," he replied. "Any green leaves he could get a hold of. That was the kind of devil Gennaro was. He used to talk about his formula and make me laugh until I was as high as a kite. God, I really love those days." I laughed out of nervousness. Pablito shook his head from side to side and cleared his throat 2 or 3 times. He seemed to be struggling not to weep. "As I've already said, Maestro," he went on, "I was driven by greed. I secretly planned to dump my partner once I had learned how to make the green stuff myself. Gennaro must have always known the designs I had in those days. And just before he left, he hugged me and told me that it was time to fulfill my wish. It was time to dump my partner, for I had already learned to make the green stuff." Pablito stood up. His eyes were filled with tears. "That son of a gun, Gennaro," he said softly. "That rotten devil. I truly loved him, and if I weren't the coward I am, I would be making his green stuff today." I didn't want to write any more. To dispel my sadness, I told Pablito that we should go look for Nestor. I was arranging my notebooks in order to leave when the front door was flung open with a loud bang. Pablito and I jumped up involuntarily and quickly turned to look. Nestor was standing at the door. I ran to him. We met in the middle of the front room. He sort of leaped on me and shook me by the shoulders. He looked taller and stronger than the last time I had seen him. His long, lean body had acquired an almost feline smoothness. Somehow, the person facing me, peering at me, was not the Nestor I had known. I remembered him as a very shy man who was embarrassed to smile because of crooked teeth, a man who was entrusted to Pablito for his care. The Nestor who was looking at me was a mixture of Don Juan and Don Gennaro. He was wiry and agile like Gennaro, but had the mesmeric command that Don Juan had. I wanted to indulge in being perplexed, but all I could do was laugh with him. He patted me on the back. He took off his hat. Only then did I realize that Pablito did not have one. I also noticed that Nestor was much darker and more rugged. Next to him, Pablito looked almost frail. Both of them wore American Levi's, heavy jackets, and crepe-soled shoes. Nestor's presence in the house lightened up the oppressive mood instantly. I asked him to join us in the kitchen. You came right in time, Pablito said to Nestor with an enormous smile as we sat down. The maestro and I were weeping here, remembering the Toltec devils. Were you really crying, maestro? Nestor asked with a malicious grin on his face. You bet he was, Pablito replied. A very soft, cracking noise at the front door made Pablito and Nestor stop talking. If I had been myself, I would not have noticed or heard anything. Pablito and Nestor stood up. I did the same. We looked at the front door. It was being opened in a most careful manner. I thought that perhaps La Gorda had returned and was quietly opening the door so as not to disturb us. When the door was finally opened wide enough to allow one person to go through, Benigno came in as if he were sneaking into a dark room. His eyes were shut, and he was walking on the tips of his toes. He reminded me of a kid sneaking into a movie theater through an unlocked exit door in order to see a matinee, not daring to make any noise, and at the same time not capable of seeing a thing in the dark. Everybody was quietly looking at Benigno. He opened one eye just enough to peek out of it and orient himself, and then he tiptoed across the front room to the kitchen. He stood by the table for a moment with his eyes closed. Pablito and Nestor sat down and signaled me to do the same. Benigno then slid next to me on the bench. He gently shoved my shoulder with his head. It was a light tap in order for me to move over, to make room for him on the bench. Then he sat down comfortably with his eyes still closed. He was dressed in Levi's like Pablito and Nestor. His face had filled out a bit since the last time I had seen him years before, and his hairline was different, but I could not tell how. He had a lighter complexion than I remembered, very small teeth, full lips, high cheekbones, a small nose, and big ears. He had always seemed to me like a child whose features had not matured. Pablito and Nestor, who had interrupted what they were saying to watch Benigno's entrance, resumed talking as soon as he sat down, as though nothing had happened. Sure, he was crying with me, Pablito said. He's not a crybaby like you, Nestor said to Pablito. Then he turned to me and embraced me. I'm so glad you're alive, he said. We've just talked to La Gorda, and she said that you were the Nahual. But she didn't tell us how you survived. How did you survive, Maestro? At that point, I had a strange choice. I could have followed my rational path, as I had always done, and said that I did not have the vaguest idea, and I would have been truthful at that. Or I could have said that my double had extricated me from the grip of those women. I was measuring in my mind the possible effect of each alternative when I was distracted by Benigno. He opened one eye a little bit and looked at me and then giggled and buried his head in his arms. Benigno, don't you want to talk to me? I asked. He shook his head negatively. I felt self-conscious with him next to me and decided to ask what was the matter with him. "What's he doing?" I asked Nestor in a low voice. Nestor rubbed Benigno's head and shook him. Benigno opened his eyes and then closed them again. "He's that way, you know," Nestor said to me. "He's extremely shy. He'll open his eyes sooner or later. Don't pay any attention to him. If he gets bored, he'll go to sleep." Benigno shook his head affirmatively without opening his eyes. "Well, how did you get out?" Nestor insisted. "Don't you want to tell us?" Pablito asked. I deliberately said that my double had come out from the top of my head 3 times. I gave them an account of what had happened. They did not seem in the least surprised and took my account as a matter of course. Pablito became delighted with his own speculations that Doña Soledad might not recover and might eventually die. He wanted to know if I had struck Lydia as well. Nestor made an imperative gesture for him to be quiet, and Pablito meekly stopped in the middle of a sentence. "I'm sorry, Maestro," Nestor said, "but that was not your double." "But everyone said that it was my double." "I know for a fact that you misunderstood La Gorda, because as Benigno and I were walking to Gennaro's house, La Gorda overtook us on the road and told us that you and Pablito were here in this house. She called you the Nahual. Do you know why?" I laughed and said that I believed it was due to her notion that I had gotten most of the Nahual's luminosity. "One of us here is a fool," Benigno said in a booming voice, without opening his eyes. The sound of his voice was so outlandish that I had jumped away from him. His thoroughly unexpected statement, plus my reaction to it, made all of them laugh. Benigno opened one eye and looked at me for an instant, and then buried his face in his arms. "Do you know why we called Juan Matas the Nahual?" Nestor asked me. I said that I had always thought that that was their nice way of calling Don Juan a sorcerer. Benigno laughed so loudly that the sound of his laughter drowned out everybody else's. He seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. He rested his head on my shoulder as if it were a heavy object he could no longer support. "The reason we called him the Nahual," Nestor went on, "is because he was split in 2. In other words, any time he needed to, he could get into another track that we don't have ourselves. Something would come out of him, something that was not a double, but a horrendous, menacing shape that looked like him but was twice his size. We call that shape the Nahual, and anybody who has it is, of course, the Nahual. The Nahual told us that all of us can have that shape coming out of our heads if we wanted to. But chances are that none of us would want to. Gennaro didn't want it, so I think we don't want it either. So it appears that you're the one who's stuck with it." They cackled and yelled as if they were corralling a herd of cattle. Benigno put his arm around my shoulders without opening his eyes, and laughed until tears were rolling down his cheeks. "Why do you say that I'm stuck with it?" I asked Nestor. "It takes too much energy," he said. "Too much work. I don't know how you can still be standing. The Nahual and Gennaro split you once in the eucalyptus grove. They took you there because eucalyptuses are your trees. I was there myself, and I witnessed when they split you and pulled your Nahual out. They pulled you apart by the ears until they had split your luminosity, and you were not an egg anymore, but two long chunks of luminosity. Then they put you together again. But any sorcerer that sees can tell that there is a huge gap in the middle. What's the advantage of being split? You have one ear that hears everything and one eye that sees everything, and you will always be able to go an extra mile in a moment of need. That splitting is also the reason why they told us that you are the maestro. They tried to split Pablito, but it looks like it failed. He's too pampered and has always indulged like a bastard. That's why he's so screwed up now. What's a double then? A double is the other, the body that one gets in dreaming. It looks exactly like oneself. Do all of you have a double? Nestor scrutinized me with a look of surprise. "Hey, Pablito, tell the maestro about our doubles," he said, laughing. Pablito reached across the table and shook Benigno. "You tell him, Benigno," he said. "Better yet, show it to him." Benigno stood up, opened his eyes as wide as he could, and looked at the roof. Then he pulled down his pants and showed me his penis. The Gennaros went wild with laughter. "Did you really mean it when you asked that, maestro?" Nestor asked me with a nervous expression. I assured him that I was deadly serious in my desire to know anything related to their knowledge. I went into a long elucidation of how Don Juan had kept me outside of their realm for reasons I could not fathom, thus preventing me from knowing more about them. "Think of this," I said. "I didn't know until 3 days ago that those 4 girls were the Nahual's apprentices, or that Benigno was Don Gennaro's apprentice." Benigno opened his eyes. "Think of this yourself," he said. "I didn't know until now that you were so stupid." He closed his eyes again, and all of them laughed insanely. I had no choice but to join them. "We were just teasing you, maestro," Nestor said, in a way of an apology. "We thought that you were teasing us, rubbing it in. The Nahual told us that you see. If you do, you can tell that we are a sorry lot. We don't have the body of dreaming. None of us has a double." In a very serious and earnest manner, Nestor said that something had come in between them and their desire to have a double. I understood him as saying that a sort of barrier had been created since Don Juan and Don Gennaro had left. He thought that it might be the result of Pablito flubbing his task. Pablito added that since the Nahual and Gennaro had gone, something seemed to be chasing them, and even Benigno, who was living in the southernmost tip of Mexico at that time, had to return. Only when the three of them were together did they feel at ease. "What do you think it is?" I asked Nestor. "There is something out there in that immensity that's pulling us," he replied. "Pablito thinks it's his fault for antagonizing those women." Pablito turned to me. There was an intense glare in his eyes. "They put a curse on me, maestro," he said. "I know that the cause of all our trouble is me. I wanted to disappear from these parts after my fight with Lydia, and a few months later I took off for Veracruz. I was actually very happy there with a girl I wanted to marry. I got a job and was doing fine until one day I came home and found that those four mannish freaks, like beasts of prey, had tracked me down by my scent. They were in my house, tormenting my woman. That bitch Rosa put her ugly hand on my woman's belly and made her shit in the bed, just like that. Their leader, 220 buttocks, told me that they had walked across the continent looking for me. She just grabbed me by the belt and pulled me out. They pushed me to the bus depot to bring me here. I got madder than the devil, but I was no match for 220 buttocks. She put me on the bus. But on our way here, I ran away. I ran through bushes and over hills until my feet got so swollen that I couldn't get my shoes off. I nearly died. I was ill for 9 months. If the witness hadn't found me, I would have died." "I didn't find him," Nestor said to me. "La Gorda found him. She took me to where he was, and between the two of us we carried him to the bus and brought him here. He was delirious, and we had to pay an extra fare so that the bus driver would let him stay on the bus." In a most dramatic tone, Pablito said that he had not changed his mind. He still wanted to die. "But why?" I asked him. Benigno answered for him in a booming, guttural voice. "Because his pecker doesn't work," he said. The sound of his voice was so extraordinary that for an instant I had the impression that he was talking inside a cavern. It was at once frightening and incongruous. I laughed almost out of control. Nestor said that Pablito had attempted to fulfill his task of establishing sexual relations with the women in accordance with the Nahual's instructions. He had told Pablito that the four corners of his world were already set in position, and all he had to do was to claim them. But when Pablito went to claim his first corner, Lydia, she nearly killed him. Nestor added that it was his personal opinion as a witness of the event that the reason Lydia rammed him with her head was because Pablito could not perform as a man. And rather than being embarrassed by the whole thing, she hit him. Did Pablito really get sick as a result of that blow? Or was he pretending? I asked, half in jest. Benigno answered again in the same booming voice. He was just pretending, he said. All he got was a bump on the head. Pablito and Nestor cackled and yelled. We don't blame Pablito for being afraid of those women, Nestor said. They are all like the Nahual himself, fearsome warriors. They're mean and crazy. Do you really think that they're bad? I asked him. To say they're bad is only one part of the whole truth, Nestor said. They're just like the Nahual. They're serious and gloomy. When the Nahual was around, they used to sit close to him and stare into the distance with half-closed eyes for hours, sometimes for days. Is it true that Josefina was really crazy a long time ago? I asked. That's a laugh, Pablito said. Not a long time ago. She's crazy now. She's the most insane of the bunch. I told them what she had done to me. I thought that they would appreciate the humor of her magnificent performance. But my story seemed to affect them the wrong way. They listened to me like frightened children. Even Benigno opened his eyes to listen to my account. Wow, Pablito exclaimed. Those bitches are really awful. And you know that their leader is 220 buttocks. She's the one that throws the rock and then hides her hand and pretends to be an innocent little girl. Be careful of her, maestro. The Nahual trained Josefina to be anything, Nestor said. She can do anything you want. Cry, laugh, get angry, anything. But what is she like when she is not acting? I asked Nestor. She's just crazier than a bat, Benigno answered in a soft voice. I met Josefina the first day she arrived. I had to carry her into the house. The Nahual and I used to tie her down to her bed all the time. Once she began to cry for her friend, a little girl she used to play with. She cried for 3 days. Pablito consoled her and fed her like a baby. She's like him. Both of them don't know how to stop once they begin. Benigno suddenly began to sniff the air. He stood up and went over to the stove. Is he really shy? I asked Nestor. He's shy and eccentric, Pablito answered. He'll be that way until he loses his form. Gennaro told us that we will lose our form sooner or later, so there is no point in making ourselves miserable in trying to change ourselves, the way the Nahual told us to. Gennaro told us to enjoy ourselves and not worry about anything. You and the woman worry and try. We, on the other hand, enjoy. You don't know how to enjoy things, and we don't know how to make ourselves miserable. The Nahual called making yourself miserable impeccability. We call it stupidity, don't we? You are speaking for yourself, Pablito, Nestor said. Benigno and I don't feel that way. Benigno brought a bowl of food over and placed it in front of me. He served everyone. Pablito examined the bowls and asked Benigno where he had found them. Benigno said that they were in a box where La Gorda had told him she had stored them. Pablito confided in me that those bowls used to belong to them before their split. We have to be careful, Pablito said in a nervous tone. Those bowls are no doubt bewitched. Those bitches put something in them. I'd rather eat out of La Gorda's bowl. Nestor and Benigno began to eat. I noticed then that Benigno had given me the brown bowl. Pablito seemed to be in great turmoil. I wanted to put him at ease, but Nestor stopped me. Don't take him so seriously, he said. He loves to be that way. He'll sit down and eat. This is where you and the women fail. There is no way for you to understand that Pablito is like that. You expect everybody to be like the Nahual. La Gorda is the only one who's unruffled by him. Not because she understands, but because she has lost her form. Pablito sat down to eat, and among the four of us, we finished a whole pot of food. Benigno washed the bowls and carefully put them back in the box, and then all of us sat down comfortably around the table. Nestor proposed that as soon as it got dark, we should all go for a walk in a ravine nearby, where Don Juan, Don Gennaro, and I used to go. I felt somehow reluctant. I did not feel confident enough in their company. Nestor said that they were used to walking in the darkness, and that the art of a sorcerer was to be inconspicuous even in the midst of people. I told him what Don Juan had once said to me before he had left me in a deserted place in the mountains not too far from there. He had demanded that I concentrate totally on trying not to be obvious. He said that the people of the area knew everyone by sight. There were not very many people, but those who lived there walked around all the time and could spot a stranger from miles away. He told me that many of those people had firearms and would have thought nothing of shooting me. Don't be concerned with beings from the other world, Don Juan had said, laughing. The dangerous ones are the Mexicans. That's still valid, Nestor said. That has been valid all the time. That's why the Nahual and Gennaro were the artists they were. They learned to become unnoticeable in the middle of all of this. They knew the art of stalking. It was still too early for our walk in the dark. I wanted to use the time to ask Nestor my critical question. I had been avoiding it all along. Some strange feeling had prevented me from asking. It was as if I had exhausted my interest after Pablito's reply. But Pablito himself came to my aid, and all of a sudden he brought up the subject as if he had been reading my mind. Nestor also jumped into the abyss the same day we did, he said. And in that way, he became the witness. You became the maestro, and I became the village idiot. In a casual manner, I asked Nestor to tell me about his jump into the abyss. I tried to sound only mildly interested, but Pablito was aware of the true nature of my forced indifference. He laughed and told Nestor that I was being cautious because I had been deeply disappointed with his own account of the event. I went after you two did, Nestor said, and looked at me as if waiting for another question. Did you jump immediately after us? I asked. No. It took me quite a while to get ready, he said. Gennaro and the Nawal didn't tell me what to do. That day was a test day for all of us.